hope you saw the announcement or the change on the schedule that we are indeed actually talking about the Arab Spring during this section, not the ethno-sectarian conflict. Right? They're going to be somewhat similar in nature. They're kind of the left hand and right hand of the same kind of conflict going on in a lot of ways in the Middle East. We're going to start off talking about this thing called the Arab Spring. Before we do that, let me get an idea from all of you how familiar you are with basically what the Arab Spring is, what took place, what's been happening since, and so forth. By raise of hand, how many of you feel like you are very, very, very comfortable with the topic, very, very knowledgeable about it, would not have any concern about prepping yourself in a debate, would not have any concern about sitting in a political science seminar class and chatting with your colleagues about what went down and so forth? Anybody? How many of you feel pretty comfortable about having a debate about the issue and being able to prep yourself and say, all right, we have a debate about this, I know enough about it to prep? Got a little bit there? Okay, and how many of you feel like, gee, I don't know, I just don't know what's going on there? It's pretty complicated stuff. I feel like that's where I'm at a lot of the times too, because I think that the more that you end up learning about this particular issue in this particular part of the world, you find out that there's really a lot that you don't know. I've spent the last 45 minutes reading articles about what's going on in Libya and realized I just didn't know what was going on in Libya, even though I thought I did. Right, so there's a lot of things for us to cover. I want to make sure that we have a general understanding of what's going on. So we're going to talk sort of about a general idea about what this thing called the Arab Spring is and or was, what it continues to be. We will also kind of take a look at some of the common factors involved across the entire region, and then we're going to try and break it down into a couple of the specific countries and take a look at what happened and is continuing to happen in those particular areas. Okay, because some of them are ongoing conflicts still, even as we speak today. All right? So, the Arab Spring is this wave of revolutionary demonstrations, protests that took place across the Arab world roughly beginning in September 2010. It's kind of hard to put a date on when, social trouble begins in any part of the world because these are things that are constantly brewing under the surface for quite some time. But we do see a fairly significant increase in the momentum of popular uprisings taking place in this part of the world at this time. And a lot of different things take place at this time. You can see from the map, there are a lot of different things happening in different countries. In some places we have full-on revolution, where the leadership is deposed, right? Where they're completely kicked out of power. In some places we have countries where the leadership fought back, and they're still in power, and they're engaged in a civil war within their nation. In some places we have something short of civil war, but still sustained civil disorder, where there's fighting and people being killed, but we might not necessarily call it a civil war. When we start talking about international law and relations and that kind of stuff, there are actual technical definitions of what a civil war is. There has to be so many number of casualties, there has to be so many number of people on each side has to control X amount of territory, etc. For our purposes, I think we'll kind of use a little bit looser definition of civil war because it's kind of hard really to define those things. It's also sometimes hard to know exactly who's who and who controls what in most of these countries on any given day because it shifts so much. In some places we just had major protests. Okay, but when we talk about major protests, how many of you have been to a protest in the United States? You've been to a war protest, you've been to a protest about tuition rates on campus, you've been to a protest about the new railroad tracks coming through town, you've been to a protest, I'm sorry?
Police meetings.
Absolutely. There's lots of different reasons why people will protest in this country. When you go to protest in this country, do you usually see tires burning? Not that often. Do you see cars burning? Hardly ever. Right? You don't really see that kind of thing happening at protests in the United States. Do you see police brutality take place at protests in the United States? Sometimes. Right? Certainly sometimes. A lot of the anti-war demonstration during the Iraq War were broken up with riot police and rubber bullets and all that kind of stuff. And some people were actually hurt, quite seriously. Particularly in places like Oakland, they were fairly serious. right? But not the kind of protests that you see in other parts of the world, where there are burning walls of vehicles to prevent two opposing parties, groups of people, from reaching each other, or to keep the riot police out from your part of the neighborhood that you now control. There's a building on fire over here, there is scattered gunfire over there. It's a lot different when we talk about major protests going on in this part of the world. We're going to kind of take a look at a little bit of that. In some places there were just simple protests and even governmental reforms. Some of these governments responded by saying, you're right, we probably do need to catch up with the times, we probably do need to take the next few steps forward in a more secular, more democratic society. Just a few steps, little baby steps, right? But there were a few governments that decided to do that. And in some places there were protests outside of the Arab world that were happening simultaneous to the protests happening inside the Arab world. So a lot of different things. The other thing I should mention is that some of these states, some of these nations had a variety of these different things happen. Like Egypt, they had a revolution. They've also kind of had a civil war. They also had something that's not even on there called a military coup. Right? Yemen is another country that they've kind of had major protests, that kind of have regime change, kind of not, kind of have a civil war, kind of not. Right? So these categorizations are a little bit loose. Okay? There are a bunch of different things that have happened in some of these different countries. We'll talk about some of them. In addition, we've been talking about the Arab world. Right? We've been talking about the Arab world. Anybody want to throw out some definitions or some ideas of what is that? What's the Arab world? What are we even talking about here? Any rough ideas? Yeah.
Members of the Arab League.
That's a pretty good definition, right? It's a very clean and precise definition in terms of the members of the countries that are members of an international organization called the Arab League. Right? The Arab League is kind of, for lack of a better explanation, the UN for majority Arab population states. Okay? So it's kind of like the UN for Arab nations. So that's a pretty good definition. What's another way we might define the Arab world? What about the way we speak? What happened? What's unique about or common about the way they speak in the Arab world? They speak Arabic, right? So linguistic or cultural connections across the world, right? Where Arabic is a predominant language. What about the way we worship? There's some commonalities there too, because Islam is the predominant religion in the Arab world. Is Islam the only religion in the Arab world? No, it is not. Are there Arab Christians? There are. Are there Arab Buddhists? There are. Are there Arab Jews? There are. Are there Arab Hindus? There are. Are there Arab Zoroastrians? Yeah, there are. Are there Arabs that are atheists? Yeah, there are. There are Arabs that are a lot of different things. Arab is an ethnicity, right? As opposed to being Muslim, which is a religion. Right? But a lot of times, and particularly in this country that we live in and are currently in, a lot of people don't get the difference between the two. Right? If you are Arab, therefore you're Muslim. That's not true. If you're Muslim, therefore you're Arab. Also not true. Right? A lot of commonality, but not the same thing. Right? So we have to kind of understand what we're talking about when we talk about this thing called the Arab world or the Arab Spring. So one of the definitions that Korry mentioned was the Arab League. You can see right there the nations that are members of the Arab League. They are the countries that get together. They have a predominantly Arab population, and they make some decisions about that region.
Is it the dark
And they
green?
try to work together. Sorry?
I just saw the little Arab League members, the dark green versus the light.
Oh, down at the bottom? Yeah. There are a couple that lie off in the distance, but largely it's a connected piece of land. I put a picture there of their flags, because this part of the world has particularly colorful flags. Right? They're kind of interesting. But this area of the world is linguistically, culturally, and even religiously somewhat aligned with one another. Right? There's a lot of commonalities. That doesn't mean that there's not diversity, but it does mean that there are heavy influences of the Arab culture and the Arabic language. In some ways, this thing that we call the Arab Spring is associated with another thing that happened in 1989 called the Autumn of Nations. Okay, and the Autumn of Nations is something that happened around 1989, 1990, and was essentially the fall of communism across Europe and Asia. So there are some big things happening in the world at that time as well. We see the Soviet Union basically start to be dismantled. We see the fall of the Berlin Wall. Right? The fall of the Berlin Wall is a pretty big deal in international relations. It is a pretty big deal in the East-West conflict that's going on. It's a big deal in the Cold War. And essentially is the harbinger of doom for the Cold War. Right? It says, you're about over. Because the Berlin Wall falls. So when this happens, we have a number of different states that fall out of the orbit of the Soviet Union. You have the Baltic states, the Eastern European states, you have the Caucasus states, and you have the Central Asian states, or the stands. Right? That all become their own sort of independent nation, and they take on this. It's sort of like a democratic movement, right? Instead of all of these being controlled from Moscow, now all of a sudden these different places are autonomous, and they control their own stuff, make decisions for themselves. Okay, so it's democratic in nature, if we're talking about meta-democracy, right? It's a devolution of power, I guess is the best way to explain that. Okay? So this idea, well, sorry, let's go just a little tiny bit further with that. So we have the fall of the Berlin Wall. We also, in 1989, we have this thing happening where anybody, how many of you, just by raise of hand, recognize this picture? Right? So somebody shout out, where is this? Tiananmen Square. Right? In China. My guess is that in a lot of the recent news articles, because we just passed a like 25-year anniversary or something like that, right? That if you were to go around the college campuses in China and show this picture to people, I read an article about this, that they went around college campuses in China and showed them this picture, and fewer people in China knew what this was than in the United States or European nations. They've censored it, they've covered it up, right? But 1,000 people died that day or more, right? And so there was this big change in the world at that time. That's why we are talking about the Arab Spring, sorry, back one more, the Arab Spring as being somewhat reminiscent of what happened here in 1989. This big, massive, large-scale change in the way the world is oriented. This big, big kind of change. In order to understand a little bit more of this, we're going to jump just for about 5, maybe 10 minutes into some deep history. Okay, we're going to go back in history for about 5-10 minutes so that we understand some of the foundation of this region, so we understand where it's coming from, because we have to understand the different historical influences that have taken place here in order to understand the present realities. It's hard to really get what's going on in the Middle East if you don't at least sort of get what has been happening in the Middle East for thousands of years. All right? We'll go through the old stuff pretty quickly. We think about this area, we call it the Cradle of Civilization. You have major civilizations developing in Mesopotamia, the Nile River Valley, the Levant, Anatolia, etc. You can see this list of empires, starting with the Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonians, ancient Egypt, the Hittites, the Phoenicians, moving on down through the centuries. So way back in the day, thousands of years ago, this is an area of the world that different imperial powers just moved right through, right? And took it over, and it was an area that connected Africa, Asia, and Europe. And so you have conquesting powers, controlling imperial powers, moving through in these different ages of time, and they bring their own politics, their own language, their own religious practices, their own political structures, their own method of fighting, their own, etc. What's one of the very first things that a colonizing power used to do back in those days? What's one of the very first things they would do when they actually captured the capital of the other, smaller kingdom that they were gobbling up? Anybody? In order to control language and culture.
They would kill the people that originated in that
They would kill leadership. They would kill teachers.
Women,
They would
too. Women.
kill women. They would kill people that were kind of, they would kill leadership. They would kill teachers. They would kill women. They would kill women. They would kill teachers. They would kill women. They would kill leadership. They would kill teachers. They would kill women. They would kill people that were kind of revitalizing or maintaining that culture or those ideas. One of the other things that they would also do is they would sack the library. They'd go to the Royal Library, the archives, and they would burn all the scrolls, because that's the record of that people. That's the language and the customs and the practices of that people. Then they know that if they can just get through one generation, that the current people who are living, that culture kind of doesn't exist anymore. Because the people who were living it are now dead. They've now had children, and the next generation is alive, and they can be taught anything else. And all the record is gone, the written story, the scrolls, the books. Right? And so that's one of your quickest ways. That started way back in this day. Some of them didn't have written scrolls, but those that did, they would destroy them. Clear up until when the Spanish invaded Mexico, one of the first things they did was they went to the Aztec library and they burned it. Burn it down. Destroy the records. Because by destroying the records, you destroy the history. And if they don't have a history, they might, as far as we're concerned, not even have one. It's called genocide. It's called not only current, contemporary genocide, but historical genocide too. You didn't even exist, as far as we were concerned. Right? You know, people smuggle scrolls out, and we try to, you know, in some of these places, a lot of their language is inscripted on the side of a building, in a column, on a temple, that kind of stuff. Little bits survive here and there, but that's essentially what is happening. Is the culture is changing rapidly, maybe not rapidly, that's maybe a difficult word to use. Culture is changing regularly over the course of a couple thousand years here. Right? With each new power that moves in, kind of a revitalization, and they bring whatever they bring. Moving up into the more common period, we start to kind of get and understand what's going on in this region, most of us, probably in the Western education system with the Romans. That's probably when most of us start really kind of getting a picture of what's going on here. That's also about the time of Christianity being relevant in this part of the world, and that's probably in this country at least the time that we start paying attention to the history and start kind of understanding. It's what we've been taught, right? Predominantly in this country. And so that's when people in this country start being aware, not everybody, I'm speaking in generalities, start being kind of aware of what is happening here. So you see these empires spreading across this region, bringing their politics, bringing their economies, bringing their language, bringing their practices, etc. And so this is a region that has been subject to that for thousands and thousands of years. Right? A lot of this happening. They brought not only their political and economic systems, like I mentioned, but they also brought their religion. This picture or this map shows the spread of Christianity. About 300 years in the Common Era, and about 600 years into the Common Era, or after death, AD, and how quickly it exploded in this area. A lot of times we see maps in this country, boy, look how quickly Islam spread throughout this region, like wildfire. And we're kind of afraid of that. We're kind of scared about the fact that Islam spread so quickly and rapidly throughout this region. But Christianity did the same thing. 600-700 years earlier, well, maybe 300-400 years earlier, because Christianity did not spread rapidly after the death of Jesus Christ, historical person or deity, right? It did not spread rapidly. It was suppressed, it was suppressed, it was suppressed. And it took a couple hundred years for it to kind of gain a foothold. And then it really gained a foothold when the Eastern Roman Empire, right? Constantinople, right? Converted to Christianity, and at that point, all of a sudden, the Roman Empire said, everybody's going to be Christian, because they became Christian. And that's where you see the spread of Christianity. So, we see Christianity spreading in this region. And still today, you have little pockets across this region of little Christian communities that exist in these little secluded villages, these little mountain hamlets, these little desert villages, and so forth, and even decent-sized towns spread across this part of the world still. And each of those others, the Assyrians, the Greeks moved through this whole area, right? This guy named Alexander the Great, moved through all this area, controlled a huge empire. That's why you still see in little pockets around here and to Iran, you don't really see that on this map. And even on the edge of Afghanistan, you have little pockets of Greek-speaking people because they were remnants. They were left there. And that's why when we see in the last couple of days how the United States says, what are we doing again in Iraq? dropping bombs again in Iraq. One of the reasons we're dropping bombs is to protect a particular culture of Yazidis in northern Iraq, and they are holdover Zoroastrians. Zoroastrian, anybody know what the Zoroastrians are? I think only the Zoroastrians really know what Zoroastrianism is. It's kind of a, go ahead.
It's like an ancient Persian religion.
I'm sorry?
Ancient Persian religion.
I still can't hear you.
It's a Persian religion, right? From Iran, right?
Yes. Comes out of Iran, Persian, essentially, and then as it moves throughout the rest of the region, it takes on, it influenced Islam a little bit, it influenced Christianity a little bit, and so you have a group like the Yazidis who are kind of a combination of some sort of Muslim-type beliefs, some Christian-type beliefs, and also a whole lot of Zoroastrian beliefs. The Muslims in the area, the Christians in the area, they think they're devil worshippers. All right, and all of a sudden the United States is called into action to protect this group of 50, 60,000 Yazidis that have been forced out of their village, the one real main village, probably 2 or 3 other small ones scattered around it, into the mountains. Because Islamic State has been coming and saying, convert, or leave, or die. Those are the 3 options you're given, right? And so they've gone into the mountains, they're starving, etc. So there are these little pockets that exist throughout this region. We're jumping ahead a little bit. We're starting to get a better idea of the way these pockets exist, the spread of these beliefs. Islam spreads very, very rapidly. With the spread of Islam, you have probably, and the Arab Empire, and again, we're back to talking about Arabs now, and this whole Arab idea. When we have the Arab Empire spread across this whole region, it's probably the first time that this region has been under such unified control and interest. A particular language, a particular set of ideas and beliefs, a particular political system, right? And so now we have a real serious influence on this region as a whole that follows on the spread of Islam and the Arab Caliphate. You can see the spread of Islam in this map. It goes all over the world, but there is this chunk in here that is predominantly Arab, or Arabic speaking. Let's jump ahead a little bit. The Ottoman Empire, big, massive empire. We're going to watch the second little video, animated video. Watch the Ottoman Empire grow here. And the timeline, 1300 small, starting in Anatolia. Then it begins to grow rapidly and expand its base of power and territory. The 1500s, about the time Columbus sails, it controls most of North Africa and the Middle East. We talk about the British Empire, we talk about the French Empire, we talk about the Spanish Empire. They were small in comparison at the time to this. They were also not nearly as powerful as this, most powerful empire in the world at the time. Okay? Then you can see it starts to shrink because as all empires do, they get too big, they can't keep control of it. They start to get people saying, we don't like your control, and it starts to shrink again. But for hundreds of years, the Ottoman Empire is the dominant force in this region. That's important because when does the Ottoman Empire basically fall apart? Early 1900s, right? World War I is kind of the time when Ataturk says, Ottoman Empire's over, we're just the Republic of Turkey. Also France, Great Britain, Russia, they'd all ganged up on the Ottoman Empire and said, man, those guys, they're too big and too strong, let's gang up on them. All right, it's a little bit of balancing of powers. The slightly smaller powers gang up on the big one in order to size it down a little bit. And they start picking off little chunks here and there of the empire. Plus the empire's gotten kind of bloated. There's a lot of bureaucracy. It's not that efficient anymore. They're greedy and power-hungry people, in Istanbul that aren't really paying attention to the far-flung regions of the empire. Same thing that happened in Rome. It starts to fall apart. And the European powers start getting bigger and stronger, and their combined force was just too much for the Ottomans. Couldn't handle it. But that means that this region, for hundreds of years, was dominated from here, from Istanbul. Dominated. Okay, so that is kind of the overall imperial nature of this region. Then when the Ottomans leave, let's go back one. When the Ottomans leave, the Europeans just step in. The Ottomans finally lose all their possessions, but the Europeans step in. The British control Iran, the French control Syria, the French control Tunisia, the British control most of the Arabian Peninsula and Iraq. Right? So they just supplant one imperial ruler with another. Yeah.
Yeah, what kind of cultural impact did it leave on a lot of those countries and stuff? As
A lot.
Yeah.
It left a lot of, what we see probably today is, in those countries, is probably not terribly different from the cultural practices and happenings during the latter stages of the Ottoman Empire, culturally speaking. Politically speaking, very different, obviously, because you have new nation-state systems that just showed up in the mid-50s out of nowhere. They just drew lines on the map and said, well, you're Syria, I guess. Right? I mean, that's kind of what happened when the Europeans decolonized. Right? When the Europeans left Africa, when the Europeans left the Middle East, they kind of just said, well, we're done here. This is kind of where we've gotten to, so we'll draw a line there. That's not the only thing they did, but I'm being a little bit exaggerating just a tiny bit. You know what I'm saying? They started drawing lines on the map and saying, we want to wash our hands of this place. We're done. Which groups, cultural groups that had been in conflict with one another together. It also took particular cultural or ethnic groups and split them into separate places. And, just to give a quick example, the Kurdish people in northern Iraq, southern Turkey, northwestern Iran, eastern Syria, southern Azerbaijan, because they're in all those countries, they occupy this chunk where there are millions of them, 10, 12, 15 million, something like that. But they are divided amongst all those other nation states. They're a minority population in each of those countries, and they're not treated well in any of those countries. They're the largest, what we might call, group of indigenous people in the world that do not have a state of their own. Right? And so that's a big source of conflict in that region. Right? We're probably going to talk about the Kurds a little bit. Okay. So are we okay with that? That kind of brings us up to about where we're talking about. And the reason I was mentioning that imperial control, that domination from outside forces means that your nation or your community is not able to develop civil society. You're not able to establish your local, way of doing things. You're not able to set up your own court systems. You're not able to function as a independent party, an independent nation, because you've not done so for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Now all of a sudden you're told, all right, you're an independent country. You don't really know how to be an independent country because you've never been one. You have to provide all the bureaucracy, all the ministers of this and that and the other, all the different infrastructure for your nation. And a lot of them were somewhat ill-prepared to do so because they didn't have people trained to do that. And as a result, you saw a lot of chaos. You also saw a lot of stronger minority populations in a lot of imperial places. A lot of colonial powers will pick a favorite minority group and favor them because they know that in exchange for favoring them and protecting them, they're going to do business with the imperial power. They'll collect taxes, they'll take their cut and send the rest on to Istanbul or to Paris or to, right? So you have these minority populations. You also have, for lack of a better expression, military strongmen that rise up and take control militaristically with force, and they rule their country with an iron fist, right? And so you see these countries not able to really develop democratic institutions because it's not been a possibility. That's what I wanted to get to in terms of us talking about the motivations for the Arab Spring. I'm doing the same thing with the time. I'm forgetting that we started at 1:30 instead of 1 o'clock, and all of a sudden I went, oh crap. But no, we're good. I'm 20 minutes ahead of schedule here. So we all good? Okay, so let's talk about some of the causes, the common motivations or factors that played into this thing called the Arab Spring. But did it make sense how we have to know a little bit of that history to understand why there is that situation on the ground, why it's problematic? There are some common causes or motivations for this change. You cannot say there was any one cause of demonstration or protest in all of these countries in the Arab world. There's not. Each one had their own reasons, each one had their own conditions, each one had their own set of circumstances that were unique to that place and that time. but we can also draw a few common themes. One of them that is probably the most common is political corruption. Political motivations. There's a general sense of oppression in these countries. People do not have freedom of speech. People do not have freedom of the press. You often don't have freedom to vote. Most of these places there, you don't vote. And if you do vote, you either vote for the single person that's running or you don't vote at all. There's one person that you can vote for. And even if a majority say nay, it doesn't matter. Right? So there's a lot of this lack of political freedoms, violation of civil liberties and human rights. People are treated poorly. They don't have a lot of protections. Yeah.
So on the note of this, is this kind of political dissent similar to the reason that a lot of, like for instance, like terror groups and like rogue groups are gaining a foothold in countries like Somalia and Iraq, where like people just don't have bureaucratic or political structure? So I know, for instance, like Al-Shabaab like provides like
Sure.
bureaucratic infrastructure.
Sure. We talked about that a little bit yesterday.
Yeah,
didn't we, about how a lot of these, we hear about these Islamic terrorist groups throughout the Middle East, and there are some groups in the world. Some of them are Islamic terrorist groups that are doing some nasty, wicked, evil, bad things to people around the world. There are some groups that are doing evil, wicked, bad, nasty things to people around the world that aren't Islamic terrorist groups as well. There are different groups all over the world that are doing bad things. There are some of these groups in the Middle East that are doing some bad things to people. However, we have to also remember that even these organizations like Hamas, organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, many of them originated as Islamic charity groups. They're Islamic groups, and they realized that the one main thing that people needed was, food. They needed to be able to eat. They needed health care. They needed medicine. They needed maybe a little bit of education. They needed a little bit of job training. And so some of these groups like Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ba'athist Party, they gained some of their influence and their popularity because they provided some of those basic needs of society. Now you could be cynical about that and say, well, yeah, but it was just a recruiting tool. Maybe. Maybe it was just a recruiting tool. Okay, but even if that's the case, it was a recruiting tool. They got a lot of people to support their ideas and their causes because they were the only one that were actually doing things like giving them food and a job and money to pay for their bills and take care of their children and so forth, because nobody else was doing it. And they stepped into that void and filled that vacuum and created a lot of positive capital. The Islamic State. We hear about the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria over the last couple of weeks especially, and all the terrible things are going into towns and rounding people up. What's your religion? If it's not the exact one that they want, then they cut your head off. Right? You see, there are children dying left and right. You see beheadings happening in all these places. But at the same time, you know what else they're doing? They're operating a wheat mill in northern Iraq. They took control of the dam, not just so that everybody's like, oh no, they controlled the dam, they're going to flood Baghdad. They're probably not going to flood Baghdad. They're going to operate the dam in order to produce this thing called electricity that they will then use to fuel their new Islamic State. Or they'll sell it off to whoever else wants to buy the electricity and raise revenue. Right? I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture of these groups that we call terrorists. I'm trying to say that there's a little bit more color here than just one. Right? There's a lot of different things that these groups are involved in doing. You get the good with the bad. So you have political violations, and the question is pertinent in that, yes, when you see people that are struggling under these kind of circumstances, they're looking for someone to help them. And when the government doesn't help them, they look to somebody else. And sometimes that person that steps in are the ones with guns. Or that group that steps in are the ones with guns. Sometimes there's a group that steps in without guns. That happens too. But sometimes the group that steps in has guns. And one of the reasons they have guns is they use the guns to protect themselves, to fight their enemies, and to raise money, to take territory, etc. So most of these protests, though, began as a call for basic reforms. A lot of these protests did not begin with, behead the fat pigs. It was, hey, stop torturing us. Help us get out of poverty. We'd like a job. We need a job. We need some basic fundamental reforms of society because we're dying here, right? We're struggling here. We need some of this. So a lot of them began as simple calls for basic reforms. There were economic motivations. You have widespread poverty in this part of the world. You also have a lot of riches in this part of the world. You have extremes in this part of the world. There's a lot of oil wealth. Not in every Arab country, but in a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, there's a lot of oil wealth. And in some countries, that means that the people of that country are extremely rich. Kuwaitis, a lot of them are pretty wealthy. Qataris, a lot of them are pretty wealthy. The people in the Emirates, a lot of them are pretty wealthy. But you go to the countryside of Egypt, there's a lot of poverty. You go to the countryside in Syria, there's a lot of poverty. You go to the countryside in Iraq, and there's a lot of abject poverty. Right? So there's this real split, an income gap, and wealth dispersal. You also have to remember that some of those Arab states that have a lot of oil wealth are somewhat small in terms of population. Their populations are usually somewhat smaller, whereas you get to some of these other countries, Iraq has a lot of oil, but Egypt, you got a lot of people, big population. It's hard to provide for that. So you have some economic problems. You have high unemployment. You particularly have high unemployment amongst the youth. Really high youth unemployment, 15 to 25, in that range, right? So you got a lot of young men and young women that don't have a job. And I mean a lot of them, the vast majority of them. Unemployment rates up around 45, 50% for that category, right? What are they going to do? What do teenagers in the United States of America do when they've got too much time on their hands? They find a way to get in trouble, a lot of times, right? They raise hell. And sometimes, in a situation like that, they're getting in trouble. Sometimes they're stuck with trying to figure out, they've got a responsibility to help the family. They've got to provide some sustenance. Some of them are now in their early 20s, and they're married, they have children. They've all of a sudden got their own family. A lot of these places, family is a different definition than the type of nuclear family we talk about here, where you have multi-generations living together in the same household, where the grandchildren are now responsible for taking care of the grandparents. The 15, 16, 18-year-olds are responsible for taking care of not only their grandparents, but probably their cousins' grandparents. And it's a little bit more communal in a lot of places. So you have responsibility. So economic problems are a big issue. One of the economic issues right there, that one, food insecurity. If you can't eat, if you're starving, that motivates people to do a lot of things. Right? It's no longer just, I'm sitting around waiting for my unemployment check to come in the mail. We got lots of stereotypes in this country about unemployment, and I'm playing into one of them now. But I'm just sitting around playing video games, waiting for my unemployment check to show up. But in a country like that, is there an unemployment check showing up?
Nope.
No, there's not.
No
Right?
video games either.
I'm sorry?
No video games either.
No video games either in a lot of places, right? So certainly the people that are waiting for the unemployment check to show up, there are certainly video games across the Middle East, but the ones who are waiting for the unemployment check to show up, they don't have video games. Right? They've probably got a soccer ball. There's probably a neighborhood soccer ball, or there's probably a football in every neighborhood across the Middle East, probably the whole world outside of the United States. Anyway, we digress. Government corruption. Kind of the same thing as the political problems. There's a lot of government corruption, but specifically nepotism. We all know what that means. That means basically you promote your family. And when we talk about family, again, we're going to use an expansive definition and call it a kinship group or a tribe, a clan. Your family is bigger than your parents and your siblings. It's bigger than your grandparents and their children, like your cousins and aunts and uncles. It's, big. It's a kinship group. It's larger than that. We can probably all be a little bit understanding when we talk about the tribes of Israel. We all probably have heard that a little bit. We're talking about tribal societies where there are family and kinship groups, and that's often how you organize your sets of loyalties. I think we might even talk about this later, but I'll mention it now because it's come up. In this part of the world, you also have different levels of identity and loyalty, the development of how you identify yourself, and also where your loyalties lie. In this country, when we think about it, are there lots of different ethnicities in this country? Yeah, there are lots of them. Probably as many different ethnicities in this country as any country in the world, because it's a magnet. People come from all over the world to live here. Right? New York City probably has as many ethnicities in it as any other country in the world. It probably really does, right? But in this country, do we also have lots of different religions in this country? Yep, lots of different religions. Are there lots of different languages spoken in this country? Yep, lots of different languages. But are we also pretty comfortable with just kind of referring to all the people in this country as Americans? Kind of comfortable with that. Not everybody. We also use some, terms like African American, Latino American, to start making some separate Asian American. We start making a few different distinctions and everything, but we're also comfortable with identifying ourselves with our nationality. The nation, right? We're patriotic. But in this part of the world, your first level of identity or loyalty is probably with your tribe or your kinship group, your family unit. That's the first way you identify yourself. In this country, I might identify myself first as saying, well, I'm American. Then I might say, well, I'm Caucasian. Then I might say I'm not religious. Then I might say I'm whatever. I might find some other ways to define male. I might find some other ways to define myself, right? Different intersections. In this place, we often start with the family or the tribal unit, the clan. The second thing we move to is essentially our ethnicity. There might be multiple tribal or family groups within a particular ethnicity. When we talk about ethnicity, we're talking about cultural groups, linguistic groups. They carry the same practices and customs, speak the same language, right? After that, then we begin to use this thing called sectarian identity or religious identity. So people are a particular ethnicity before they're a particular religion. In Iraq, we have Sunni Arabs that have been in conflict with Kurdish Sunnis. Sunni Arabs and Sunni Kurds. Right? Different ethnicities, same religion. Roughly, there are some differences there too. But you understand what I'm saying, right? Difference between ethnicity and religion. So we see this issue of sectarianism starting to creep in. It's always been there, but it ebbs and flows, and at different times in history, it rises to the point of conflict. There are some times when the sectarian divide doesn't really matter. You all know what the Ba'ath Party is? B-A'-T-H. That was Saddam Hussein's political party in Iraq. He didn't start it. The Ba'ath Party started 40, 50 years before that. But the Ba'ath movement, which was also the leadership in Syria, there's a Ba'ath Party as well. Bashar al-Assad's the Ba'ath Party. Right? The Ba'ath Party is a socialist party, and we see that some of those groups, when they were formed by both Sunnis and Shia. I was reading the other day about the formation of the Ba'ath Party, and the main people who started the Ba'ath Party, they were like, we didn't even know what each other's sectarian affiliation was. Didn't matter to us. Some of them were Shia, some of them were Sunni, some of them we didn't know. We didn't really care. We had the same political drive. We had the same political interest. So sometimes in history, the sectarian division, it doesn't really matter. Or some points or particular situations, the sectarian division doesn't matter. Right now, in the last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, we're seeing a rapid increase in the sectarian divide being very important and significant. Right? But it's not as important to other times. Where else are we at? Rising expectations, international influences. We talked before about video games. Do they have video games? Yeah, some do. Right? How many people in the world have an internet connection? What percentage of the world has an internet connection?
20%.
It varies. You see different people saying different things, but anywhere from 5 to 8 to 10. Regular access to the internet. How many of you, by raise of hands, how many of you access to the internet once per day? At least once per day. How about twice per day? 3 times per day? 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 15, 20, 25, 40, 50.
You're never not connected?
Right?
Yeah.
Are you exactly? Right? It's become a part of life. In this part of the world, this may be 5, 6, 8, 10%. They even have access.
Our world would collapse if we didn't have access for like one day.
Exactly.
Are there any known direct causes for why sectarian violence has become more prominent in the last 10 years?
There are probably lots of theories about that.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about a couple of them coming up. All right. So, But Matt, that's a good question. I mean, because you can't separate that question with, why is it such a big deal now,
Yeah.
and deal with some of this. So we're going to kind of answer that question steadily as we move along.
I just imagine those kinds of arguments would be really useful in
And
debate.
what?
Those kinds of arguments would be really useful in debate, like knowing what's
Right.
causing.
Right. For instance, let me give you an example. This is an example that for several years in debate rounds, not only in debate rounds, but in this thing called American society, right? For several years, there were people talking about, oh, Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein were connected. They were connected. Oh, Iran, they're supporting Al-Qaeda. We should go bomb Iran because they're supporting Al-Qaeda. And these are people like, senators saying this just nonsense bullshit. It's not true. Why is it not true? Because when we think about Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda is a radical extremist Sunni group. Are the clerics in Tehran Sunni? No, they are not.
Probably get rid of
Do
that.
they get along with Al-Qaeda? No. In fact, there's probably no there's probably no 3 or 4 individuals in the world than Saddam Hussein, Ayatollah Khamenei or Khomeini, either one, Bashar al-Assad or his father, or Hosni Mubarak, who have killed more Islamic extremists than anybody else in the world, right? Because they have crushed Islamic movements in their country. The government and the military of Iran, they crush radical Islamic movements whenever they can because they want to be the only radical Islamist movements. Right? Hopefully there are no people in the room that have connections to. Anyway, in addition, Saddam Hussein crushed Islamic militant movements in his country. He crushed them because he was secular and because he was just a butcher on top. He was ruthless. But if you're a ruthless, brutal, authoritarian, secular ruler, do you want Islamic movements and groups operating in your country? No, you do not. It's the last thing you want. So to give you an example, Al-Qaeda probably disliked Saddam Hussein more than they disliked, well, maybe not George Bush, because he's special. Right? They probably disliked him more than any other because there's a unique thing about Bush, whether you like him or dislike him. But the United States. Al-Qaeda was probably more upset and more anti-Saddam Hussein and that party than the United States. Why? Because at least Saddam Hussein was a Muslim. As far as Al-Qaeda is concerned, he should know better. He's right there, born and bred. Right? Or born and bred, born and raised. One of those. One of those. Raised and bred. It's raised and bred, raised and breaded and anyway, so does that make sense? Right? Yet we seem to make this connection between, one of the big justifications for the war in Iraq was Saddam Hussein was supporting Al-Qaeda. Is there any proof? Well, no. Do we have any evidence to suggest? Well, no. Does it stand to reason in any way, shape, or form when we actually put it to the tiniest bit of reasoned test? Well, no, it doesn't. It makes zero sense whatsoever. But in this country, not only does the population kind of tend to fall into that, but even our elected leaders fall into that kind of mentality. We have representatives and senators that are talking about Saddam Hussein supporting Al-Qaeda, therefore let's go to Baghdad. Right? That same kind of thing is happening in debate rounds sometimes too, where people don't understand the difference between Sunni, Shia, don't understand the difference between Palestine and Pakistan. I watched a debate round where a debate about the occupied territories, Israel, Palestine, when for the entire debate one team called them the Pakistanis. And I was like,
It's funny until it's not.
we've essentially taken reality, set it aside. How many times have you been in a debate round where you recognize that reality has been set aside for a while? We're no longer talking about things that are true and real. We're in fantasy land. Really, right? So it makes it difficult. That's why it's important in some of those debate rounds, because if you know the distinctions, it's pretty easy to just kind of say, we're not talking about Pakistan. and it changes the debate entirely. They're assuming that these people are Sunni. They're not. They're Shia. Changes the debate entirely. Right? And so if you know those things, you can control the direction of them. All right. We talked about a couple of those different types of oppression. I'm going to show you a few graphic images of them, like maps and such. This first one shows you the lack of political freedom. There's this organization called Freedom House, and they do an assessment. I think it's annual. This one's a little bit dated. I haven't updated it, but not much has changed. It's 2010, but not much has changed. You can see across this region that there is what they call not free. It's not free. You don't have political freedoms. You don't have freedom of the press. There's only a couple of countries in this area that even make the yellow color, which is partly free. And there's only one that is in the green for free, and that's Israel. And there are probably a lot of people who would have a concern about the designation of Israel as having a free press, or at least all of Israel, right? Because some people consider the occupied territories part of Israel, but are the Palestinian people who live in those occupied lands, do they really have a voice in government? No, they don't. Right? So you can see that this is a region that has very, 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 very few political freedoms. You can also see this map shows the level of food insecurity across this part of the world. It's high. There's a lot of food insecurity. And so when you can't feed your family, you're reduced to doing extreme things. Anyone heard of Mohammed Bouazizi? We're going to talk about him in just a minute. People are reduced to doing extreme things. Let's talk about some of the methods and the techniques that were used. Again, we cannot make the generalization that all of these techniques were used exactly the same in each of these different countries. They weren't. Each one took on its own unique flavor, its own unique mechanisms and style, but there also are a few commonalities. They had marches, they had rallies, they had demonstrations, they had sit-ins, just like we might imagine happening here in this country.
I'm sorry, these are methods and techniques of how these.
For the Arab Spring.
Okay.
For the demonstrations and the protests of the Arab Spring. What did they do? The people who were rising up in rebellion or in demonstration and protest. So this first bullet point there, some of the same kind of things we might see happening here when maybe the protests get to a larger extent. Maybe the closest that we probably come in this country to some of the protests and demonstrations that are going on here is the civil rights era, right? Where you saw, there were lynchings, there were mobs, it was a little bit more serious in this country than in most places.
What about the Rodney King situation?
The what? Oh, Rodney King in LA. That's a very good example too. Large scale, lots of people in the streets, rioting, looting, smashing shit, right? And a lot more happening. Those are the times or the WTO protests in Seattle. Those are a few times where we see protests happening in the United States that are a little bit more similar to some of the protests that happen in other parts of the world. But a lot of the times when people have a protest here, I've actually heard a variety of activists talk about, can you really call it a protest if you have to get a permit for it? Can you really call it a protest if the only way you can protest is if you file the proper papers, you got the permit, and stand in the particular zone that it's okay to have your protest? Right? There's a difference, a significant difference in the way those kind of things are handled. So you saw some of those things happening. You also saw riots and clashes with security forces, where people are throwing rocks and bottles and bricks at the riot police that are lined up. And sometimes the riot police are firing back with, when it gets serious, rubber bullets. Or maybe, lots of tear gas and shot grenades, stuff like that. And then sometimes it gets a little bit more serious and they fire live rounds. Sometimes it gets more serious and they fire lots of armed rounds. Sometimes it gets more serious and they start running, armored vehicles and tanks through the crowd. And it tends to escalate in different situations and in different countries. Sometimes we had general strikes to try and bring the economy to a standstill, because if you can hurt the economy, then you capture the government's attention. If you can hurt the economy, the government has to pay attention to you. The problem is you might not like the way that they pay attention to you. Okay? Sometimes we have armed insurrection. If the government doesn't respond with the reforms that you wanted to, sometimes people thought, well, the only thing we can do now is take up arms. Sometimes people were, protested, they were fired upon, and their response was, well, okay, government had a chance, now I guess we fight. We have to protect ourselves. Sometimes there were groups that just said, let's just skip this whole, negotiation part, let's fight. There were a variety of different groups that were doing different things in different places. But by and large, let's be clear about this, by and large, the protests that were taking place in the Arab Spring started off predominantly in a peaceful manner. Peaceful, non-violent manner. Now, some people would say, well, when you start throwing bricks, that's maybe no longer peaceful and non-violent. Yeah, maybe so. But that came after a lot of the demonstrations and uprisings had not been responded to by the government with any even sort of, semblance or sign of a positive reception by the government. Okay? So again, it's escalating. Sometimes we formed armed insurrections where you actually have organized groups creating militias to fight against the government. That's when it starts getting really serious, because that's when you see little hit squads of maybe 10, 15, 20 armed individuals hitting a government checkpoint. And when the government has a checkpoint hit by a little squad of anywhere from 3 to 20 fighters, all of a sudden they say, okay, it's real. And that's when they bring the big guns.
Where would self-immolation fit in? Because I know
We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Mohammed Bouazizi. Yes, we will talk about that for sure. Sometimes that grows into this thing called opposition councils, where you have political parties, you have armed militias, you have maybe some professors from the university, you have some business people, business leaders in the business community. You often have a lot of people who are exiled. You have people that were Syrians that didn't live in Syria anymore because they were against the Assad regime. They live in Paris, or they live in Tunis, or they live in Cairo, or they live in London, or they live in wherever. They live somewhere else, but then they try to influence the happenings back in the country. A lot of times they were, political leaders, academics, scientists that left the country, and they form an opposition council in cooperation with some people on the ground. But sometimes the fighting groups in the country, they don't recognize the authority of the opposition council because they say, what are you talking about? You're not in charge here. We're the ones that stayed in this country. We're the ones who have been shedding blood. We're the ones that are fighting the regime. Even sitting in your nice villa in the French Mediterranean and telling us what to do back here, it doesn't sit real well with some of them. Because they're the ones that, if the regime is toppled, they're the ones that want to move back and take up all the positions in government and business and industry and academia and so forth. And the people that are on the ground fighting say, you can be part of this conversation, but don't tell us what to do. And some of them just straight up say, you're not involved. You're part of the problem too. If you come back to town, we'll probably fight you too. Right? There are lots of different divisions and shifting allegiances. Sometimes we see foreign intervention. We see foreign intervention get involved. We know in this country, we think that Iran is behind, everything. But does Iran have a role to play in Syria? Yeah. They have a pretty substantial role that they're playing in Syria. They're pretty close with the Assad regime. There are pretty good reports that are indicating that there are at least some Iranian Republican guards that are on the ground fighting, and certainly training the Syrian army. Right? Has Turkey gotten involved in the conflict in what were we just talking about? Syria. That's the place. Has Turkey gotten involved? In a way. They provide safe harbor for some of the rebel groups that go back across the border. They provide arms. They kind of quietly provide arms. They provide shelter, so forth. Is the United States involved in any of these conflicts? Of course they are. The United States needs to be involved in everything, right? The United States is certainly involved. To what extent? Sometimes we're not sure. We're not sure how much the United States is supporting and arming rebel factions within Syria. We know they're supporting and arming some of them. We're not sure. Are the Qataris involved? The Qataris are heavily involved. Right? The state of Qatar has provided a lot of weapons to rebels fighting in Syria. They tend to provide them to the slightly more Islamic organizations. Our concern is, ooh, we don't want to give it to groups that are, heavily Islamic or even sort of Islamic. And Qatar has been like, yeah, whatever, we're cool with them. And they're arming some of those groups. They supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt when Saudi Arabia said, no, not the Muslim Brotherhood. Right? So they gave Egypt $8 billion under Mohammed Morsi. So all of these different countries are kind of acting at different purposes with one another. Social media played an important part. They talk about it as being a Twitter revolution. Not only is propaganda or important political message being put out there via social media, but also it's a tool and a mechanism for organization. Hey, everybody, be at this square at this time, and we're going to rally. Hey, everybody, there are armed troops moving down this avenue. Get the hell out of there. Hey, everybody, there's food at this particular place. That kind of thing. Right? There was a lot of that happening in this area. Let's talk about governmental reactions. How did the government respond to these rallies? Remember, are all these governments the same? They're not. They're incredibly different from one another. Were all of the demonstrations and the rallies the same? They weren't. They were different from one another. So we have different reactions. Some of the general reactions. Some of the simple reactions we saw were counter demonstrations and marches. We have to remember that in a nation like, let's use Syria, because most of us are probably a little bit familiar with what's going on in Syria. In Syria, you have a big, huge chunk of the population, the majority of the population, that hates Bashar al-Assad. But are there people in Syria that like Bashar al-Assad? Yeah, millions of them. Why? Because they were the favored group under his regime. They got all the good jobs, they got all the nice houses, they got all the special treatment, they had access to education, right? And so there were they organized counter demonstrations where you'd see 50,000 people pro-Assad marchers out in the streets of Damascus saying, no, we're showing our support for the man. We like this guy. He's taking care of us. We're with him. So you have to understand that none of these places, same thing happened with Mubarak in Egypt. There are plenty of demonstrations in favor of Mubarak. Was everybody in Iraq against Saddam Hussein? No, that's why we're still fighting in Iraq, because there were millions of people who kind of liked the way things were. And they wish it would go back to something more similar to that than what it is today. Right? So there are lots of divisions within these countries. Sometimes you saw infiltration, where the government would hire some of its security personnel to go into and infiltrate some of these demonstrations, some of these organizations, some of these rebel movements that were growing to, one, figure out what they're doing, right? Get an idea for what their strengths are, how they're organizing, also to identify leadership so that they can then go and arrest those people and make them disappear or beat them up and threaten them and try and scare them or torture them for information, etc. And maybe a third reason to serve as provocateurs. Right? When you've gotten your group together and you've got these core of 15, 20 activist organizers that are trying to figure out, hey, how can we get 5,000 to 20,000 people down on the square in 2 Saturdays from now? They try to get that together and they finally get that and they've got their 15,000 people, and one or two of the people, or maybe one of the people who was helping to organize that, knew where they were marching, what they were going to be doing. Separately, they created their own little cell or unit of maybe 30 to 40 to 50 people, secretly, that when the march or demonstration begins, they're the ones that sort of subtly break off and start smashing and breaking shit. Why do they start smashing and breaking stuff? Because that gives the security forces a green light to clap down, crank down, smash, crack. Here's the word. Maybe that was the problem. To try and find a way to crack down on the demonstrators. That's when the rubber bullets start flying. That's when the tear gas starts flying, right? Because the demonstrators, they're just moving along. They might be chanting their slogans, shouting their stuff. They're moving down this avenue. But because this little group did X, Y, Z, security forces can then justify doing what they want to the rest of the group. That happens in this country too, right? That's happened in, the civil rights movement. That's happened to the Occupy Wall Street movement. That's happened in a lot of different places, where it only takes one person just quietly throwing a Coke bottle up and over the line into the police barricade before the police say, hey, they threw stuff first. All we were doing was responding to protect our officers. And frankly, the police officers have a responsibility, the police has a responsibility to protect their officers, right? That seems fair. If you're the police, you want to protect your personnel. And so a bottle or a brick comes flying in, or a window smashes, or a tire gets set on fire, then that justifies everything else happening. Even if the police that are there, the riot police, they didn't know that there was a provocateur that was going to do that. They just did something that created the justification or the probable cause, essentially, for taking some particular action. So, in some of these places we saw negotiations. Excuse me. In some of these places we saw negotiations for political reform. Places like Jordan and Iraq. We saw some demonstrations, but the government said, okay, we'll try and make a few changes. Jordan, that's a place where the king of Jordan said, all right, you got a point. We'll try and make a few slight changes, subtle shifts in the way we go about things. And the people said, huh, cool, thanks, that's awesome. And they kind of quieted down a bit. All right, so that happened in a few places. In a few places, you had economic negotiation going on. This happened a lot in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, where there were a few. Saudi Arabia is a pretty tightly controlled society, okay? Certainly more conservative and tightly controlled than some of these others. They had a few small demonstrations break out, and the House of Saud immediately said, we're not having that in our country. But the way they chose to deal with it was they just bought them out. And they announced like a $36.5 billion social renewal program where they dumped a whole bunch of money into schools, they dumped a whole bunch of money into shopping malls, they dumped a whole bunch of money into indoor skiing I don't know what they did. But they did a bunch of these things, right? They infused the economy with a bunch of money, and people went, all right, cool, thanks. And everything was okay, right? For the most part. There were still people that were not happy. But you get what I'm saying? They kind of bought off the chance or the risk. They paid. They were flush with cash anyway. They could afford it. So they dumped $30, $40 billion into the economy, and that made everybody happy. So they didn't have to worry about protests in their country. In other places, we saw moderate crackdowns. This might have involved internet censorship, people being censored, censoring the internet, or people being arrested, things like that. Sometimes we saw severe crackdowns, things like mass arrests, people disappearing. Someone gets arrested, but then they're never ever seen again, and they're in a shallow grave out in the desert somewhere with probably another 50 or 60 other people that are laying in the shallow, unmarked grave along with them. Sometimes you saw snipers. When things started to get particularly testy in some of these places, they put a sniper on a building, a block away, and they just start firing into the crowd. That disperses a crowd pretty quickly. When all of a sudden they're like, oh, we're being sniped. We're being fired on. People leave. That's a quick way to stop a demonstration. Right? You might just randomly die because we're shooting into the crowd. Sometimes you saw regime change. When we talk about regime change, we're talking about overthrow of the government. The government loses. We saw this happen in a few places. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen. I put Yemen in italics and that funny little squiggly mark because Yemen, the president gave up power in Yemen. But he kind of gave up power to his vice president. So whether that's regime change or not, I wouldn't call it regime change. Let's take a look at some of these individual countries. Tunisia. We start with Tunisia because in large part this is where a lot of it started. Okay, we see the first protests happening in Tunisia in December of 2010. This dude down here that you can see, that is Ben Ali. He was the leader of Tunisia for, what is that, about 20 some odd years?
24.
Okay, about 24 years, long time. And essentially what happened was this gentleman right here, Mohammed Bouazizi, was a produce peddler. Right? He sold cabbage and stuff. in the market. He'd take his little cart probably down to the market, and he would sell his produce, and he would pay for his family to live and eat that way. Well, he was a particular individual that for some reason in the little town that he lived in, the police liked to pick on him. He was one of the police picked on a lot of people, but they would like to pick on him. They picked on him one day, he got arrested. They took all of his produce away probably because he didn't have the proper permits to be at the market, right? Because he couldn't afford the proper permit to be at the market, etc. Those kind of things. So they took him in. He was complaining to a police magistrate about how he'd been treated and kind of pushed around by the police. And his story is that she cursed him out and slapped him. That's his story of what happened. And this was not an uncommon occurrence. Okay, he was upset. He went to the local government and said, "I've been mistreated." And they said, "Whatever, we're not interested." Later that day, he appears in a public square with a container full of gasoline. He doesn't burn stuff down. He dumps all the gasoline on himself, and he makes a public statement about, I have to take care of my family. Right? I've tried. This is the only way I haven't taken care of my family. I'm not being allowed to take care of my family. I'm not being allowed to do the things that I need to do to feed my children. I have no other way to turn to. All of my stuff has been taken away from me. I've been beaten up by the police. I've gone to the government. They won't listen to me. No one is doing anything to help. I'm desperate. And he lights himself on fire. Called self-immolation. Right? It's a form of protest that is common in a lot of Tibetan Buddhists. Have used self-immolation as a way to protest against Chinese occupation. Right? It's happened in a variety of different places. Over the course of a few days, he's burned over 90% of his body. He survives for about 18 days. He's alive for about 2 weeks. He's in a coma. He dies. And this is kind of the thing that sets off these protests in Tunisia. People are very upset about this, and they start massing in public squares. Right? We'll take a look at how that functions in just a moment. But it happens in Tunisia first. And this little cartoon is kind of illustrative of Tunisia. And anybody recognize that face? Hosni Mubarak.
Oh.
That is Hosni Mubarak. It's a cartoon. And Tunisia was the domino that got tripped to start sending all of these going. Okay? So, that's a look at what protests look like in Tunisia. That's a little bit different than Occupy or U.S. anti-war or and even anti-abortion demonstrations in the United States. This next moves on to Egypt. Oh, I'm sorry, and I should have just mentioned that after a month or two of this, Ben Ali says, I'm done. He quits. He flees the country. He leaves. All right, so we have regime change. Right? The ruler has been deposed, kicked out of office, run out of town with his tail between his legs. Move on to Egypt. Some big and important stuff happening in Egypt. That's say 245?
Yes.
Cool. In Egypt, the ruler at the time is Hosni Mubarak, and you can see how long he'd been in power. What's that, 30 years? Dude had been in power for 30 years, was not democratically elected. Anybody have heard the name Anwar Sadat? He was the leader of Egypt, and he was kind of one of the first Arab leaders to say, you know what? We probably need to make peace with Israel. We probably need to make peace with Israel for the benefit of everyone, because we can't continue this constant state of living in a state of war. He was assassinated.
What's his name? The person you're talking about who said that?
Sadat.
Oh, was it Sadat?
Anwar Sadat. And it was essentially, he was assassinated largely because of those views. And that's when Hosni Mubarak stepped in, okay, and took on the leadership of Egypt. Now, Hosni Mubarak in the United States was a welcome figure. We like this guy in the United States. Our foreign policy and the presence of Hosni Mubarak being in control was a good thing, because he was somewhat friendly to the West, and because he maintained peace with that neighbor right there called Israel. He said, yep, we're done fighting Israel. We won't fight Israel. And for us, that was like, great, we'll give you, what do you need? Guns? Tanks? Money? And we'll give it to you. We give billions of dollars of aid, in military aid, to Egypt in order to maintain peace with Israel. And also to control the Suez Canal, and also to be a moderate force in Northeast Africa, and also, right, there are a number of reasons, but, yeah.
Well, I'm forgetting what the name of the treaty is that established that long-standing peace between Egypt and Israel.
What about it?
What the name of it was?
Good question. Somebody look it up. You've all got machines open and smart stuff. You have machines that are smarter than me, quicker recall. So at that time, he's pretty important, but he also rules with an iron fist. He rules with an iron fist, and so the people are not treated well. So they rise up in rebellion too. And we see mass demonstrations going on across Egypt. And when we say mass demonstrations in this situation, we're talking about millions of people. Millions of people on the move. Millions of people finally standing up and saying, no more. We'll not take it. Things must change, and Hosni Mubarak has got to go. Right? You see these tanks mixed in with the crowd. It's significant that the army, the Egyptian army, during this uprising, at this time, they stayed out of it. They said, gee, you know, the people seem to have a legitimate beef here. They're demonstrating peacefully. They're demonstrating peacefully, non-violently. They seem to have a legitimate concern here. So the army kind of sat back on the sidelines and said, what's going on here? We're going to kind of just play observer status for a little while. We're not going to jump into the fort. When we saw in some of these places where there were battles between the protesters and security forces, those were Mubarak's security forces. That's like the police, not the army. The difference between those two. The army was kind of on the sidelines, waiting to see what was going to happen, right? Biding their time, etc. There's an awful lot of respect for the Egyptian army amongst Egyptians across the nation. A lot of respect for the Egyptian army. They're highly revered, well respected, etc. So, Hosni Mubarak loses. He finally departs. He quits. He runs out of town. They chase him out of town. He flees for his own security. There's an interim time when there's a transitional government set up. But then after a little while, this dude right here, in the upper left-hand corner, on the right side of the picture, wearing the suit and tie, Mohammed Morsi, who comes up through the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been an outlawed political party in Egypt for decades, an illegal political party in Egypt for decades, and crushed whenever possible by Hosni Mubarak, right? He becomes the first democratically elected head of state in Egyptian history. But it didn't last for long, because the people of Egypt were not very happy about the way he ruled Egypt. They were concerned that it was something like, I can't remember the name of the party he created, the Freedom and Justice Party, something like that. They couldn't call it straight up the Muslim Brotherhood Party because, it's politics, propaganda, connotations, concerns, that kind of stuff. But it's essentially the Muslim Brotherhood. He created policy that favored the Muslim Brotherhood. He took the resources and hoarded them. He made lots of decisions about his control over the judiciary, his control over the legislative branch. And a lot of people said, no. We didn't want a new dictator just because we got rid of the old dictator. We didn't really like this. And so a whole bunch of new protests rose up. And again, literally millions of people rose up in the summer of 2013, shortly, less than 1 year after he'd become democratically elected, and rose up against him. Now, understand that in the election that took place, the options were essentially Mohammed Morsi or one of Hosni Mubarak's guys, one of Mubarak's lieutenants. That was essentially their choice in that election. Given that choice, the people said, let's try something new. Let's go a different direction. But the people didn't like it. This time this time the military got involved. Partly because the military didn't like the Islamic nature or the Islamic leanings of the Muslim Brotherhood and having so much influence in government. The army is predominantly secular. They have ties to Western militaries. They have strong ties to the United States military, right? Because they get a lot of money. A lot of money, about $1 billion a year from the U.S. military, right? And training, etc. And so the military, who first handed control over to Mohammed Morsi, then deposed him. You see this dude down in the bottom right-hand corner? That's Fattah al-Sisi. He is now the president of Egypt. He was elected, I don't know, a couple months, maybe a month or two ago, just recently. He's in another picture in this slide. See that general up there? Handing power over to the president? That's him. That's that guy. Right there. Right? So, the army said, all right, you were democratically elected. The people said, we didn't like the way you ruled. And so the army said, oh, well, I guess then we'll have a coup. There was a coup. He was arrested. A whole bunch of the Muslim Brotherhood leadership were arrested, sentenced to death. The Muslim Brotherhood party was again outlawed. Right? So, this craziness going on in Egypt. Yemen. Is that enough about Egypt? You okay there? Let me mention one other thing about Egypt. Let's go back. That's the other thing we should have mentioned. This area right here, the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula is significant for a number of different reasons. That is during the Arab-Israeli wars. During the Arab-Israeli wars of the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. That was kind of a staging ground for where the Egyptian military would launch its attacks against Israel. So Israel fought back in the Six-Day War, and they took the Sinai Peninsula, took it away from Egypt, and said, we're not going to let you attack us from there anymore. Right? And took it over. The peace treaty allowed for Israel to step back and hand over the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt, but the agreement was that it would remain demilitarized, and the Egyptians are not allowed to put their military, except for small numbers and at special times, into the Sinai Peninsula. There's something called the MFO, the Multinational Forces Operation, that operates in this area. It is a peacekeeping organization that is not part of the United Nations. It is a separate organization. It is not under the auspices of the UN. It's the US, Britain, it's France, it's, I don't know, maybe Netherlands. There's a few of those kind of countries that kind of patrol this area, although the US doesn't do much direct patrolling in there. That would be too confrontational, it'd be too controversial. They operate in this region. The problem is that means that Egypt does not have a military presence in the Sinai Peninsula, which makes it a really, really enticing location for militant organizations to train, develop, organize, etc. So Israel, and frankly the rest of the world, is a little bit concerned about the fact that things are so bad in Cairo. So maybe another thing I should have mentioned is that Mohammed Morsi takes power. There's still a lot of fighting and conflict going on in Egypt. Most of his problems are concerned with Cairo and the urban center going up and down the Nile. That's what he's concentrated on. His country has fallen apart. That's where a lot of the concentration is, which means there's a power vacuum out here. Nobody's really paying attention to this. Police forces aren't really operating out here, which means extremists from all over the Middle East are saying, oh, there's a place we can go and work. There's a place, a base of operations. And then carry attacks out against Egypt. They attack the Egyptian government. They attack the Israeli government. They attack the Jordanian government, right? They don't really discriminate when it comes to government. They're like, oh, we'll attack them all. They like some of them less than others. But see what I'm saying? So Israel is very concerned about having a pro-Israel leadership in place in Egypt. The United States is very concerned about having a pro-Israel. Pro-Israel is maybe a strong term, but a neutral, I guess I should say. A neutral on Israel. They don't want to fight Israel. government in Egypt. So that's pretty important. That's kind of important to know. We're not just talking about Egypt and Israel. We're talking about the role of the government in protecting the Sinai Peninsula. So when you get into debates tomorrow, about Israel-Palestine and this region, you should pay attention to the Sinai Peninsula because it's pivotal in what happens between those two nations. The other thing that's important is, see the upper right-hand corner of that map? What's the one word that you see there in the upper right-hand corner? Not Israel. Gaza. Right? The Gaza Strip. Egypt is critical in how this conflict in the Gaza Strip is going to play out.
I read that he had closed off access for people from Gaza to Egypt.
That Egypt has closed off? Oh, absolutely. For a long time, Egypt was kind of, a lot of the Arab states have a hit and miss attitude about the Palestinians, right? They use it to rally their own people to say, down with Israel. But when it comes down, right down to it, what have the Arab states done for Palestinians? Not a ton. Not a lot. Okay? In fact, I'm not saying this is my position, but there are some who would argue that Israel has done more for the Palestinian people than the surrounding Arab states have done for the Palestinian people. It's kind of a weird twist, isn't it? Right? They've built roads. They've provided security. They've collected taxes. They've created education. They've provided humanitarian assistance. What have the other Arab countries done for the Palestinians? Use it as a propaganda piece when it comes for election time? Use it to rally their forces about something? Right? Because in a lot of these places, the Palestinians are not welcome. Anybody spent time in the Middle East? Anybody? I was there a year and a half ago. I was in Jordan, and Palestinians and Jordanians, they don't so much get along that well. I was on a bus, a small, 15-seater bus, and so of course I had 30 people on it, where I saw a fight break out between the Palestinians and the Jordanians on the little mini bus. There was me and one other, I'd say Westerner, but he was from New Zealand, so I'm not sure if we would say Westerner. Me and a Kiwi were on the bus, we were a couple of seats across from each other, and this argument broke up, the police got involved in all of this, and we were shooting glances at each other, saying, do you know what the hell is going on? Because I don't know what the hell is going on. I'm a little nervous. Because, we're talking shouting, yelling in people's faces, the bus pulling over and people calling out and fighting, the police getting involved. I was like, we throw glances at each other like, you know what's going on? I don't know what's going on. Do you know what's going on? I don't know what's going on. So I'm kind of quietly hunkered down in my seat, kind of saying, yeah, nobody take notice of me. Don't worry about me. I'm not really here. I'm just watching. It's cool. And so there's a lot of animosity between different groups in this part of the world. And that's one of them, the way the Palestinians fit into all of this. The Palestinians are great as far as Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Syria or Iraq is concerned. The Palestinians are great when they're fighting Israel. That means we don't have to fight Israel. But do anything to provide, care and comfort to the refugees? Nah, we don't want to do that. Right? So there's this strange relationship between all of them. In Yemen. Yemen is an interesting country in that there's a lot going on, yet it's very, very poorly understood in the United States. We hear a lot about Egypt. We hear a lot about the Suez Canal. We hear a lot about Israel and Egypt relations, that kind of thing. We hear about Gaza. We know that Egypt is negotiating, that Egypt is playing the mediator of the negotiations between Hamas and Israel. Right? So they're playing a very, very important role here. Egypt is also an incredibly important Arab country throughout history. It's got pyramids, for goodness sake. Right? And it's also got a big population. It's a very, very important player in Arab politics, right? In the Arab world. Yemen, not so much. We don't hear that much about Yemen in this country. Despite the fact that many people are now saying that there is an Al-Qaeda cell, the splinter group of Al-Qaeda that is in Yemen is probably the most powerful and operational Al-Qaeda group in the world right now. Right? Because Al-Qaeda's not one simple, single thing. Al-Qaeda is a lot of different things, a lot of different groups that sort of, do their thing with them and sort of do their own thing. So it's hard to exactly say what Al-Qaeda is, but the Al-Qaeda offshoot group down there, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as they're called, is probably the most active, the most well-organized, they have the most resources, the most abilities of any Al-Qaeda group in the world right now. Right? Because the group called Islamic State, ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, that's making all this trouble right now, they're a group that even Al-Qaeda said, no, they're too extreme. Al-Qaeda publicly declared, no, they are not part of our group. They take things too far. All right, so lots of different divisions going on. In Yemen, sorry. Ali Abdullah Salah. He is the leader for a long time. Again, we have another 34 years. He is the leader of Yemen. Again, non-democratic countries. These people rule forever and ever and ever. In Yemen, we have an interesting situation in that there's a lot happening in Yemen. Yemen used to be North Yemen and South Yemen. It was split between North Yemen and South Yemen. Al-Qaeda has an active presence. You also have different provinces or states in Yemen that are seeking independence. They want to break away from Yemen. They have fought civil wars with each other. There are both Sunnis and Shias and other sects in this area that do war and battle with one another. Take a look at this map. This is more of an ethnic and sectarian division of Yemen. You can see that it's divided. This is a divided nation. You have a group up here in the north. This darker green is the Shia. They're called the Houthi rebels, or Houthi Shia. And they've been fighting against the government. There's, a lot of people suspect that they're probably being supported by Iran. Iran, Shia, right? Or Shiite. Not Sunni, but Shia. The Houthi rebels up here in the north, Shia. And in the last few years, all of a sudden, they've gotten their hands on some heavy weaponry. Mortars, artillery, some stuff like that. Maybe not artillery, but mortars. Right? And where did they get them? Probably Iran. Probably. Well, there's pretty good indication that, an Iranian boat came out of the Persian Gulf, came into here, and popped onto, some oceanside here, and they unloaded a whole bunch of rockets. It's probably pretty plausible. Some of the fighting that's going on here, there were hundreds of people killed in this conflict, but Salah, the leader, refused to give up power. He had some of his own generals splitting from him, creating their own units in the military that then fought against the army. You also have radical groups with their own militias that are fighting against both of them. You also had Sunnis and Shias fighting each other. You also had particular provinces that said, well, we're not so much concerned about the Sunni Shia thing, we just don't want to be part of Yemen anymore. We think we should be a separate state. Lots of different fighting going on here. He eventually abdicated his position. His compound was attacked with mortars. He was caught up in the bombing. He had burns over 70% of his body. He went to Saudi Arabia for care. But even then he said, no, I will not step down. Well, that's actually not true. Salah went through his process about 3 or 4 different times of saying, yes, I'll step down. I'll hand power off to somebody else. And then he reneged on that promise 3 or 4 times, literally. I think it was maybe 3 times that they went through that process. And each time he said, psych, not going to do that. And a renewed round of fighting. He was hoping that he could, placate people for a little bit of time while he strengthened his position. And then he would promise again, and it happened. Finally, he gave up power. But again, he gave up power to his vice president. Is that really regime change? I would argue no. That is not regime change. Some of the fighting in Yemen, some of these images. But again, you see people that are against Salah, but you also had people that were, mobilizing in his favor. These are split societies. I can't emphasize enough that we cannot get into the oversimplification of thinking that all people in Egypt were out there to fight against Mubarak, that all people in Syria are out there to depose Bashar al-Assad, that all people in Yemen were out to depose Salah. They're not. there are millions of people within each of those countries that still maintain their loyalty to the government because they're the privileged group. They're the ones that had it good or still have it good under that leadership. So of course they're going to fight on that side. A lot of times we think it's, one leader against an entire country, but it's not. We oversimplify that in the Western media. I included these pictures just to show you that Yemen's cool. Isn't that awesome? I want to go there someday. This is called Manhattan of the Desert. This place is about 1,000 years old. High society, well-developed cultures, well-developed civilizations. Back when Europe was in the Middle Ages, back when they were in the Dark Ages, this part of the world was the top, the epitome of culture and society and civilization. Right? It's not just a bunch of people running through the desert with sandals, but that is the image that we often have in this country. Right? That is often the image that we have in this country. Libya. Now there's a looker. Right? Probably the most attractive head of state in history. All right. Muammar Gaddafi. Sorry, Muammar, but yeah. Anyway, Muammar Gaddafi. We all know a little bit more about this one, so I'm not going to cover it in as great a detail or extent. There was rebels that rose up. Let's skip a little bit of this. There were rebels that rose up. The predominant rebel group was in the east, fighting against Gaddafi, whose power was in the west at Tripoli, the capital. Also his hometown right here in Sirte. And then the UN gets involved and the US gets involved because the people mobilized and they started fighting, but Gaddafi said, I'm not leaving power. I'm going to keep fighting. I'm going to keep control of what I have. Why wouldn't I? I've been doing it for something like 40 years. The guy was the leader for 40 years. He wants to keep on going. Those are the kind of people that they don't give up easily, right? So he doesn't mind killing some of his people in order to maintain power. That's not a problem. That's like business as usual for some of these autocrats. So we have UN Security Council Resolution 1973. It runs from March to October of 2001 that authorizes the no-fly zone in Libya. It's pretty important when we take into consideration a couple of things. 27,000 sorties were flown. That's a bombing rate. Right? That's a plane going and blowing stuff up. That's a lot. Right? That's a lot. It's estimated around 60 civilians were killed. Who knows how many of Gaddafi's troops were killed, or mercenaries that were fighting on his behalf. We might talk about that in just a moment if we have a little bit of time. We're starting to run out of time. The U.S. lost a plane, but it went down for mechanical reasons. It wasn't shot down. We had a drone shot down. And the UAE lost an aircraft because they crashed it. The Libyans lost significant forces. It cost about 4 to 5 billion people. A couple of things that I want you to know in this, maybe I'll use the pointer because I can't reach that high. I want you to know a couple of countries in this list of people that participated. Qatar, United Arab Emirates. Those are Arab countries participating in an attack on an Arab country. That's a big deal. It's a really big deal to see Arab countries fighting on the side of Western nations against another Arab country. It's kind of a big deal. So when you get into some of these debates about what's going on in the Middle East, it's important to know that Qatar is an important player in this because they're willing to fight. They have a small military, but they're certainly willing to bankroll other people fighting. Right? But some of them engaged in the fighting themselves. That's a pretty big deal. The aftermath of the Libyan revolution. You see governmental dysfunction, where you have a transitional council that leads to a national council, which leads to a House of Representatives that was elected a couple of days ago, about 5 or 6 days ago. When that happened, the General National Congress was dissolved. The General National Congress had essentially three responsibilities. One, run the country. They didn't do that very well. 2, write a constitution. They didn't. And 3, set up elections for a new parliament, which they're calling the House of Representatives. This PowerPoint will be on Dropbox. you should listen to this BBC section. It will give you, in about a 4-minute spiel, a pretty good rundown of what is happening in Libya over the course of the last 2 weeks. We were going to watch it, but we're out of time to do something like that. So, in this situation, we created a power vacuum. You had somebody that had been in power in Libya for 40 years and controlled everything. Then he was removed from power, and his army was essentially removed from power. Everything that controlled that country for 40 years was like that, gone. Who's going to run the country now? The people, the rebels? The rebel groups that were fighting against Gaddafi? Okay, that's all fine and good in terms of, being all democratic and all, right? The people rose up, they kicked the tyrant out of town, or they killed the tyrant in this situation, and now they've taken control. But they don't really know how to run a government, because none of them have done so for 40+ years. They don't know how to run a ministry of education. They don't know how to run a ministry of transportation. They don't know how to run a ministry of magic. Right? They don't know how to do this stuff. So you have general government dysfunction. When you have dysfunction, you have lawlessness. When you have lawlessness, it opens the door for ethnic and sectarian violence, because groups tend to work with like, which means the ethnic groups begin to protect their own. The extremist groups begin to protect their own. They all arm, and they fight it out to see who's going to come to the top. The United States and Western nations are getting a lot of criticism right now for doing the same thing in Libya that we essentially did in this other place in the 1990s called Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we funded, 100,000 Mujahideen fighters and trained them to do one thing: stop the Soviet advance. They did so. They stopped the Soviet advance. After a while, the Soviet Union was so sick and tired of fighting in Afghanistan that they said, fine, we're done. And they left. It's kind of like our Vietnam in a lot of ways. Right? And they left. But what happened after that? We said, all right, we accomplished our objective. We accomplished what we needed to accomplish. We stopped the Soviet advance. We washed our hands of the situation and left. Afghanistan fell into wicked, evil, nasty, terrible, brutal civil war for the next decade, and the nation, or the group that rose to the top of that infighting, was this thing called the Taliban. We washed our hands of it and walked away, and look what happened. Came back to bite, right? Some people are saying same thing happening in Libya. Got rid of Muammar Gaddafi, this thorn in our side, for 40 years, but then we left, we abandoned the place, leaving everybody else to divide up into little factions and fight for the spoils. Right? And what has happened? Nobody's really risen to the top. They're all still fighting each other. So we have a civil war going on in Libya. We also have a few other events. You all probably know about the attack of the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi on September 9/11, 2012, where U.S. ambassador and three or four security personnel were killed. And of course, it was Hillary's fault. There have been all kinds of congressional hearings about how Hillary covered up what we did. Somehow she's, got this dirty skeleton in her closet that's going to get out about what she did or didn't do. Right? And there's been all kinds of political hay made about what happened. What we should probably be recognizing is that there's a larger concern about extremism and violence going on in this country, not just trying to score political points. The Libyan revolution also led to the Tuareg rebellion, or I shouldn't say led to it, complicated the Tuareg rebellion in Mali. We all probably last summer heard a little bit. We had debates about I think at NPDA, did we have a debate about Mali?
I think it was NBC.
Or somewhere we had debates about Mali, right? The ethnic group, the Tuaregs, live in this general area. When Libya was fighting its civil war, tons of arms were pouring into Libya, or they just had tons of arms. Gaddafi was hiring Tuareg mercenaries to come in and fight against the people of Libya. When the revolution was over, they went back to their respective countries, but they took their AK-47s and RPGs with them. And when they went back to their hometowns and their home countries, they now have the weapons to fight the war that they really wanted to fight. That was the war of control in their own country. But now they have the weapons and a little bit of military training and experience to do so. So it complicated things in this entire region. Syria. We have 2 minutes to cover Syria. It's not happening. We could spend 2 weeks covering Syria and not cover it. However, if you are interested, when we do the ethno-sectarian discussion on Thursday, the things that we're going to focus in on that lecture are Syria, Iraq, Kurdistan, Iran. That's what we're going to cover in that particular lecture. However, on this PowerPoint, we can go a couple of minutes here. Let's just blip through this very quickly to show you some of the things that are in place here. There's a little bit of a timeline of the way the protests developed and how it broke down into fighting. Then there are some maps to show you the ethnic, linguistic, cultural divisions within Syria. A few different maps to give you different representations. See all those different dots? Right? This is a mosaic. This is a puzzle of all these different kinds of people that are crammed all together in this little space. It's hard for people to get along when they have a lot of space, but you cram very different people all together, and they can find a thing to fight about, especially when a lot of them are hungry and starving and angry and etc. A look at the death toll. This is an old map. The death toll is much higher now. Estimates are about 150,000 to 200,000 people having been killed in the fighting in Syria over the last couple of years. The war in Aleppo is something that we'll talk about Thursday, or the second front of the Syrian fighting on Thursday. Chemical weapons, we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about what the world was doing in response to all of this, because people in Syria are saying, hey, you established a no-fly zone in Libya. Our government's killing way more of us than Gaddafi ever killed. Why aren't you doing the same thing for us? Part of the problem is Russia and China are extremely opposed, so we can't get a UN resolution through about that. And part of that is because we overstepped the bounds of the UN resolution that established the no-fly zone in Libya, and Russia and China are upset about that. Partly because Russia has some pretty important economic relations with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We'll talk about the Arab League and their efforts in Syria. We'll talk about some of the regional consequences, a little bit more about who's fighting where. This is a map of who controls what in the fighting in Syria. Does that look complicated? Does it look hard to keep track of? Look at the next one. Those are all the different splinter groups that are fighting in Syria. Shifting alliances going on all the time. Another one that shows who controls. That might be the one that was 2 slides prior. Anyway, another one with different groups that are fighting in and around. A lot of diversity here in the number of people that are fighting and the reason that they are fighting. Some pictures about it. Some concern that Russia is supporting the fighting. Iran is supporting the fighting. Russia has a naval base in Syria. That's one of the reasons that they're there. Turkish involvement, U.S. involvement, no-fly zone. Please help us, please protect us. Some other stuff we'll talk about. These are 2 websites that will give you a timeline of events of all the different countries. They're interactive. You should check them out if you really want to follow a particular country and see what happened in that conflict with the Arab Spring. Here's a list of the general reactions from different international parties to the Arab Spring. One last thing that I want to leave you with is you can take a look at this slide. These are things that are happening in America. We're seeing protests that are happening in America. We're seeing significant levels of poverty in America. Detroit has 36% poverty. A third of the people or more living in poverty. Very high levels of unemployment among communities of color in this country. Much higher than the overall level of unemployment. Why aren't we seeing the same kind of changes that happened in the Arab Spring in the United States, or similar? Are there efforts that are happening to move in that direction? Maybe. All right, so the last thing is that if you want to, and you're going to be in debates about the Arab Spring, things are going on in Egypt, things are going on in Libya, if you know a little bit about some of these sectarian, some of these ethnic, some of these divides within those countries, you're going to be 10, 15, 20 steps ahead of your opposition because you're going to get the conflict. You're going to understand how it happens. You're going to know how to nuance your uniqueness story. You're going to know how to nuance your link story so that when you get into the debate, you can say, no. You're talking about a completely different ethnic group. And that's just, you don't understand the conflict. Your credibility with the judge is going to go way up here because you know the details. In addition, beyond just our debate rounds, this is the kind of stuff that American citizens should know about. People in this country have an awful lot of influence over things that go on in the world, but because we kind of don't pay attention to anything except for what happens in our own country, a lot of this is allowed to continue because, like it or not, it's the people of this country that probably have as much ability to influence that outcome as anybody because we are in the country that has the reins of power. Right? We can't do everything in all places, but the United States can be a force for good or bad, and it's a little bit of both. The United States has done an awful lot of good stuff in the world. The United States has done a lot of crappy stuff in the world, but a lot of it comes from an uninformed population, a population that doesn't pay attention to anything beyond our own shores. So it's important for us to know about the details and the divisions and understand how they operate. All right? And we're going to make this announcement upstairs too, but the debates tomorrow are going to be about Israel, Palestine, Egypt. All right? I'm going to give you some forenotice that that's what those debates are going to be about.